Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis, and welcome to our discussion of Side 2 of the Beach Boys 2020 album. There's a lot to get to, but before we get started, I wanted to mention that I believe part 2 of my discussion with Betamax Blocker is up on his YouTube channel now. As I mentioned before, we had a great time making our picks for the weirdest track on each Beach Boy album. He's got a lot of great content on his channel, and I hope you'll check it out. Again, that's Betamax Blocker here on YouTube. And again this week, in these 3 cubicles, I put some of the new and notable releases that you might have seen on sale in the record store had you walked in to pick up a copy of the Beach Boys 2020 on the day of its release, February 10th, 1969. I think most people will agree that Side 2 is the better side of the album. Having been largely absent on Side 1, Brian is prevalent on Side 2, though much of it is earlier work that was revived for the album. Side 2, of course, kicks off with Cotton Fields. As he'd done about 3 years earlier with Sloop John B., Beach Boys resident folk fan Al Jardine brought Cotton Fields to Brian's attention as a possible song for the Beach Boys. The song was written by Hughie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly, who first recorded it in 1940. It was popularized in the folk community through its inclusion on the album Odetta and Larry at the Tin Angel in 1954, Harry Belafonte's recording of it on Belafonte Sings the Blues in 1958, and was a number 13 hit for the collegiate folk group The Highwaymen early in 1962. Al said he first heard the song in the mid-50s, and from his description, it would have been Leadbelly's version. It seems like a strange choice for the Beach Boys. Sloop John B. had the nautical angle. I certainly appreciate the Beach Boys trying to expand the subject matter in their material, but this one seems like a real departure. Researching this, I wasn't able to find any other instances of the song having the verse that begins with, "Let me tell you now how I got me in a fix. I got a nail in my tire doing lickety splits." That's the verse that rhymes hat on with directions. I also couldn't find any other instances of the lines, "Brother, only one more thing that's gonna warm you, a summer's day out in California." I assume the lyrical additions came from the Beach Boys. I wasn't able to confirm that. The summer's day in California line certainly sounds like it might have come from them. The lickety splits verse sounds like it might have come from Leadbelly, whose recordings like Fannin Street often have verses that sound like real-life stream of consciousness the way this does. Maybe it's on some version by Leadbelly that I wasn't able to locate. In any case, if the Beach Boys had written that verse, I'd have thought they'd have come up with something clearer. Does anybody know where those lines came from? Personally, I like Cotton Fields better than Bluebirds Over the Mountain, and like that track, the Beach Boys version is well done, but I don't really connect to it on any kind of emotional level. Of course, Alan will re-record Cotton Fields, producing it himself for a single A-side release in April 1970. More about that, of course, when we get to 1970. We're about to shift gears on the 2020 album now and move into a couple of very Brian songs on an album where, up till now, his presence has barely been felt. I Went to Sleep, which is credited to Brian and Carl, has always felt to me like a little brother to Busy Doin' Nothin' from the Friends album. Like with Busy Doin' Nothin', the lyrics paint a unique little Rococo portrait of a very specific time and place. The lyrics also remind me slightly of the Beatles' Fixin' a Hole. The melody is beautiful. The flutes accentuate the drowsy, humid feeling, and I've always loved the tambourine rattle that gives us the sound of the sprinkler coming on. Of course, the vocals and the vocal arrangement are outstanding. There's been some excellent stuff on 2020 up to this point, but to me, it's here that we first get something really unique and really special. Great as the other guys were in 1969, at this point on 2020, it seems like Brian has finally sauntered to center stage and effortlessly, even sleepily, blown everybody out of the water with this one-of-a-kind song. That impression continues with the next track, another rock and roll waltz from Brian, Time to Get Alone. The basic track, of course, goes back to 1967 when Brian put it together for Redwood, the band that eventually became Three Dog Night. Their version was never released, and the Beach Boys picked it up and completed it for 2020. A couple of things strike me about the lyrics. First, there's the snowy setting with the pine-scented air and toboggans in the second verse. When I first heard it, it seemed like a deliberate attempt to reset the action away from the beach and reminded me how, after so many beach party movies in the early 60s, AIP changed things up with Ski Party in 1965. Secondly, and more importantly, is Brian returning to one of his favorite themes of late, getting away from people. Another recent example is Be Here in the Morning from Friends with lines like, stay here on the weekend and unplug the phone, no calls from Korthoff, Parks, or Grillo, I only hope you'll come here alone. Of course, in both these songs and others, he really doesn't want to be alone, he just wants to be alone with people he cares about. The arrangement is outstanding with harpsichord and a fantastic string section. The group vocal led by Carl is amazing, and I particularly love the deep and wide bit in the middle section. This is one of those tracks that makes me want to do a Beach Boys channel. It's truly beautiful and probably my favorite track on the album. As I've said before, if I was trying to introduce somebody to what's great about the Beach Boys' late 60s work, this is likely where I'd start. Next up is Never Learn Not to Love, credited to Dennis Wilson. Of course, today everybody knows that the song originated with Charles Manson, who wrote it as Cease to Exist. Dennis bought the song outright from Manson for cash, some sources say it was $200, and a motorcycle. Dennis rewrote the words, restructured the song, and retitled it, and the group issued it as the B-side of Bluebirds Over the Mountain on December 2nd, 1968. Reportedly, Manson was outraged that his lyrics had been changed and made death threats, which undoubtedly became a lot scarier many months later when he went from being a creepy, aspiring musician to an infamous mass murderer. Had Manson not become infamous later, I assume the song's true authorship would never have come out. It's made me wonder if buying other people's songs and presenting them as your own was common practice. Apparently it wasn't, and this was a unique situation. Dennis claimed Manson didn't want to be credited. Engineer Stephen Desper claimed that Manson went uncredited as partial retribution for everything he stole from Dennis. Desper said, if Manson had been a decent person, the Beach Boys organization would have given him credit and treasure as they did with other writers. But Manson was a thief and did not play by civil rules. By those rules, he was compensated as far as they were concerned. End of quote. If you've heard the demo, you'll know Dennis went a long way in transforming it, bringing it up to professional standards, and making it suitable for the Beach Boys. The final recording is not at all bad, with some interesting musical and vocal arrangements. With the last two tracks on the album, the plundering of the vaults for Smile Leftovers begins in earnest. Our Prayer was reportedly a late addition to the album, with many vocal parts laid over the 1966 original at Capitol Studios. Of course, it's breathtakingly beautiful and gave Beach Boy fans one of their first indications of just what an amazing work Smile could have been. Cabinessence is very different, but just as impressive in its scope. It showcases the kind of segmented songwriting that was so much a part of the Smile project. I'm used to it after all these years, but I remember the transition from the gentle Cabinessence section to the driving Who Ran the Iron Horse section being really jarring when I first heard it. I suppose artistically that was deliberate, with the train disrupting the quiet of the frontier. No doubt both Our Prayer and Cabinessence were great revelations in 1969 as to what Smile might have been and what we missed. They still felt that way when I first heard them myself in 1980, at a time when Smile recordings hadn't even appeared on bootlegs, and it was unclear how much had been recorded or if any of it even still existed. Of course, the Beach Boys' next two studio albums will also use unreleased Smile compositions as their finales. With the release of Brian Wilson Presents Smile and the Smile box set, the attraction of these 2020 versions has inevitably diminished. When 2020 was released in February 1969, I'm sure it perplexed a lot of fans. The title is an oblique reference to the fact that this is the Beach Boys' 20th album for Capitol Records, if you count greatest hits packages. I've said in the past that I prefer this album cover to the Beach Boys' other late 60s album covers. Generally, I prefer a photo of the band to artwork, and with this being a group project more than any other Beach Boys album to date, a group photo seems appropriate. On the other hand, I can see this cover didn't do the Beach Boys any favors. The photo is nice, but it looks like it was done hastily at the last minute just to create a cover, which, from what I read, is just about what happened. The cover must have raised some questions for Beach Boys fans, including where's Brian, since he's not on the cover, and what's on the record, since there's no track listing. Assuming you went ahead and bought it, once you got it home and opened the shrink wrap, you'd have found the first gatefold cover for a Beach Boys studio album and reassuringly a photo of Brian on the inside. Over the years I've been doing this channel, I've noticed my esteem for 2020 has dissipated a little bit. There are some excellent tracks, and the group do an impressive job of stepping up to fill the void left by Brian's reduced involvement, but more and more it feels to me like a grab bag of tracks rather than an album. In some ways, it could be compared to the Beatles' recent release at the time, which felt more like a collection of tracks by the individual members. A lot of the tracks on 2020 are good, some are even great, but overall it feels less like an album and more like a collection of recent single sides and odd tracks. Following the release of 2020 on February 10th, the Beach Boys tape an appearance on NBC's Kraft Music Hall on February 16th for an episode titled Don Adams and Don Rickles Are Alive and Well and Living in California. The Beach Boys are shown lip-syncing to California Girls. The show is broadcast on February 19th. Interestingly, several sources say the Beach Boys also did I Can Hear Music on the show. It makes sense, with that planned as their new single 2 weeks after the show airs. I've seen what I believe to be the entire episode, and I don't find it part of the show. There is, however, a very brief snippet of the group obviously performing the song, shown under the voiceover introduction of the special guest stars. My guess is that the Beach Boys recorded it and that it was cut from the broadcast by the show's producers, who retained the big production number California Girls, which also happened to fit the show's California theme. If that's true, I would also guess that the Beach Boys were not thrilled that their new single was cut and the oldie retained. On March 3rd, I Can Hear Music, back with All I Want to Do, also from 2020, is released as a single. It'll peak at number 24 on April 26th. Not a great showing, but a big improvement over the prior single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain, which only went to number 61. In the UK, I Can Hear Music will go to number 10. On March 24th, the first Honey single in nearly 5 years is released by Capitol. Both sides of the single, Tonight You Belong to Me and Goodnight My Love, are produced by Brian. It's an excellent single that, like other Honey's efforts, won't chart. On March 31st, the last day of the quarter, recording begins for what will likely be the Beach Boys' last new Capitol single, written by Brian and surprisingly Murray Wilson under the pseudonym Reggie Dunbar. It's called Breakaway. We'll talk much more about it in U.S. Pop Culture 1969 Part 3. 2020 will peak at number 68 on April 12th. That's a big improvement over Friends 126 and has to be seen as a step in the right direction. Still, at this point, it's their second worst charting album, coming in 27 spaces lower than Smiley Smiles number 41 in 1967. In the UK, it'll do much better, going all the way to number 3. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Beach Boys 2020 album. As always, I look forward to your perspective and your comments. Next week, we'll return to U.S. Pop Culture 1969 and begin a look at the second quarter of the year. Hope you'll join me for that. Meanwhile, please hit like if you don't mind, subscribe if you haven't. Thanks very much for watching. Have a great week. Bye.